If you're looking for a fun, warm, and uplifting movie to watch with your family this holiday season, you've come to the wrong video. In fact, you've come to the wrong channel. I guess that Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence has a couple of glimmers, a couple of glimpses, a few drops of holiday cheer, but these are mainly overshadowed by the beatings, the depression, and the hopelessness of POWs in a Japanese prison. This is a Japanese movie directed by Nagisa Oshima, but starring David Bowie. No, David Bowie doesn't speak Japanese in the movie, but Tom Conti does. That's the guy who played Einstein in Oppenheimer. He must be really smart. Here, Tom Conti plays Mr. Lawrence, who in real life, yes, this was based on a true story, was South African, not British. Lawrence van der Post wrote the book The Seed and the Sower about his life. I'm not sure if he was the seed or the sower, probably neither one. And this movie is based on that book. After van der Post died, there were some sordid revelations about his life, and maybe this movie isn't actually based on an entirely true story. For our purposes, it doesn't matter that much, but if you want to read a grim story, you can head over to his Wikipedia page. I'll tell you right now that Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence is a deeply compelling movie, but I don't really know why. It's a mystifying movie, and it's a beautiful movie, despite being kind of strange and making some sort of weird choices. This movie takes place almost entirely in a prison camp on the island of Java. That's Indonesia, the home of the Java programming language. My knowledge of World War II in the Pacific is a little bit fuzzy. I'm not really sure what the British were doing there. I'm not really sure what the Japanese were doing there, but that's war, I guess. You don't really need to know anything about history to enjoy this movie, fortunately. Of course, this is part of a long line of POW films, a proud tradition of POW films. There's a lot of them. Why are there so many POW movies? I don't know. Looking at the cinematic landscape, you might think that the British Army spent more time in prison than anywhere else. I exaggerate a little bit, but it's an interesting small genre. Maybe it's a convenient way to make a war movie that is more like a social drama. To make a war movie without so much running around and shooting, maybe it's a nod to the camps in Germany during World War II. I'm not really sure. On top of that, we have another smaller, more niche genre of the comedic POW film or television show. This is an even stranger angle. Stalag 17 is an interesting example there. I mention it because that has a pretty good Christmas scene. Billy Wilder movie. I like it a lot, actually. It could all come down really to the success of The Great Escape. This movie is really nothing like The Great Escape or Stalag 17 or Hogan's Heroes, but it reminds me a little bit of some of the more grim POW films like King Rat, which is a Brian Forbes movie set in a Japanese prison camp in Singapore. I've covered a number of Brian Forbes movies on this channel, like The L-Shaped Room, but I never got around to making a video about King Rat. It's a great movie, unless you don't like rats. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence has elements of the classic historical POW film, but it's really very different. I think the first place that this becomes apparent is about 30 seconds into the movie when you get hit by the score for the first time. A couple weeks ago, I reviewed the film Monster and talked a bunch about Ryuichi Sakamoto, made the music for that. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2023, one of the all-time great composers. Well, he made the music for this movie, and it is really good. It's a masterpiece. But he's also in the movie. Didn't expect that, did you? He hadn't really acted in any films before this, but Oshima liked what he saw somewhere, I guess, and called him up. This score defined the movie, and it's beautiful. It's great, but it's very 1980s. And I think I was expecting this movie to have more of a historical film score with violins and cellos, not beep boop. This must have been my first hint that the movie was going in kind of a different direction than your average historical POW film. To make a long story short, this is more of an existential movie than a historical movie. Maybe it's more of a metaphysical movie. It's, I guess, a movie about cultural schism, about the relationships between the Japanese and the English in this place that is right on the edge of life. There's a lot of real people in this movie who are alienated by the violence that surrounds them and that they're complicit with. The plot of this movie is kind of weird, and it isn't really the focus. One of the things instead that defines the film is just the relationships. And one of the most important ones is the relationship between Mr. Lawrence and Yonoi. That's Sakamoto's character. Yonoi is the main guy overseeing the prison camp. And yeah, it's an unorthodox to casting, this movie, but it works. This is not a cameo, to be clear. This is one of the main characters in the film. He's at the center of everything. But it's great casting. You know, he has a lot of layers. He's principled, but he's frustrated too. He's haunted, and in a weird way, he's sort of doomed. Yonoi and Lawrence have a complex relationship. Like I said, it's one of the main elements of the movie. In some ways, it's a working relationship, right? Lawrence is not the highest-ranking prisoner, but he's the interpreter. He speaks Japanese, and he seems to have spent some time in Japan before the war, so he has a sense of the language, but also of the culture. The ranking British officer has a lot of hot air. He's gallant, perhaps to a fault, and he doesn't have an understanding with Yonoi. Ironically, this kind of loutish officer might be the hero in your typical POW film. Lawrence is sometimes accused of being too close with the Japanese. Indeed, he does have this relationship with Yonoi. Not quite a friendship, because a friendship would be impossible under these circumstances, but there is a deep relationship of some kind. That's an interesting question, by the way, in life. What deep relationships are there other than friendship? There's a lot of them, I think, and they're pretty interesting. This question of how you relate to your captor is at the heart of the film. And I actually think this is at the heart of most POW films, and maybe even most prison films, but it tends to look totally different. In most films, some kind of working relationship emerges between prisoners and captors. The most famous example has got to be, what do you think? He's played by John Banner. It's Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes, who's always consorting with the prisoners, who is always being manipulated by them. This is not how you're supposed to act. This isn't the rules that anyone is supposed to be following. But alongside the rules in these institutions, some customs emerged, because these are humans and this is their society. This movie kind of tells a similar story, except that it's not a hokey comedy where these rules are sort of these brittle comedic things, whereas the plot of the episode is coming up with a new way to manipulate this guy, right? Hogan's Heroes is all about this relationship, but it's in such a mechanical way. In this movie, it's more of a piercing look at what it means to imprison someone or to be imprisoned. You could be quite close with your captors or your prisoners. This is a fairly intense movie. It comes out of the gate fast with some pretty disturbing stuff, but it's also a subtle movie that gives time to a lot of different facets of these relationships. Most obvious, I guess, is the gallantry and the frivolity of war. I already kind of mentioned that. Language is another big part of the movie. This film has an authentic language barrier. Some of the Japanese characters speak broken English, but you almost get the sense that this is what the actors themselves might sound like if they were giving an interview in English. I don't know if that's true, but there's something kind of powerful to hearing people be stymied by language. Most films, they put the viewer first. They want to prioritize the audience understanding, so they typically don't have people stumbling around not being able to speak, right? In this movie, they do, and there's some various things you got to get across in the prison camp, and you can tell that it's a struggle. Language is kind of a defining thing of this movie, and of course it would be a defining thing of this experience. This film also engages with cultural differences. There's an interesting conversation where a Japanese officer tells Mr. Lawrence that he would have respected him more if he had killed himself. Sellers, on the other hand, that's David Bowie's character, and don't worry, we'll talk about him soon. Sellers starts the movie out by turning himself in, but by doing so in a principled manner to avoid harming innocent people. There's two very different ideas about heroism right there. We actually first meet Sellers when he is on trial. In POW movies, we're used to seeing a prison that's not a very principled place, a prison that doesn't really have anything to do with justice. A POW camp isn't about justice. It's about this overriding conflict. And this is, again, maybe one reason why sometimes these relationships emerge in spite of the circumstances or whatever. Of course, there's a lot of discipline in these movies and a lot of punishments. The discipline is kind of a staple of the prison film. But discipline and justice, they're not the same. And if anything, it's compelling when you see Steve McQueen go to the hole because of how unjust it is. It's a form of martyrdom. Anyway, unfairness, injustice is a big part of a lot of these movies, and there are undertones of injustice here, but we actually start the movie with a trial, and it actually seems like it might be a fair trial. Yonoi and the other officers who oversee it have a pride in their process. Maybe one of the most obvious things that set this movie apart is that it was made in Japan. Hogan's Heroes was not made in Germany. There is an even-handedness here that is rare for a POW movie or even for a war movie. The film was co-written by an Englishman, and it was based on a book by a South African. It was also produced by Jeremy Thomas, another Englishman who would later produce the incredible Bertolucci film The Last Emperor, which Sakamoto also scored and also appears in. This movie does not feel like propaganda either way, which is rare for a POW movie or a war movie. Maybe that's kind of the first thing that opens the door to nuances, is that both parties were truly at the table when this movie was being made. Let's talk about David Bowie. He's great in this movie. He plays this guy, Jack Selliers, Major Jack Selliers, an army guy, a real soldier's soldier who has an aura. He's a leader among men, and he seems to intimidate his captors. They don't quite know what to do with him. They can't break his spirit. In fact, they even start to worry that he might be a ghost, or he might be some spirit from the beyond. Religion and spirituality is another thing that differentiates the two sides. 9 times out of 10, this Jack Selliers character would fall flat for me. It doesn't sound like the most nuanced thing, does it? It doesn't sound like the most plausible thing. But in this case, they got lucky because it's David Bowie. And if ever there was a man with an aura, with a transcendental spirit, it's got to be him. The movie maybe relies on him a little bit too much. I'm split on this. It's an interesting question, too, about how the sort of extra textual things going on here with David Bowie. It more or less works. It's a very interesting role for him. Overall, I think it's not the only place that Oshima got lucky in some ways. There's a lot of weird things about this movie. There's a lot of things that shouldn't really work and that don't really work. The structure is circuitous. There's a random flashback towards the end of the movie, for instance. It's sort of interesting that it gives some backstory about Selliers' relationship with singing, which, might be significant given that David Bowie himself was known to sing occasionally. But I'm not sure exactly why it was in the movie. And generally, there are a lot of parts of this film that aren't obviously essential. In fact, I think almost every section could be left out. Almost every part of the movie I was watching, and I found myself thinking, why is this here? The first half of the movie, the first hour of the movie, I wasn't even sure I was going to finish it exactly because I just wasn't sure where we were going. And yet, this is an extremely compelling movie. An extremely compelling movie. Obviously, it isn't a question of luck. The film has some obvious virtues. Great music, great cinematography with some truly vivid images. The cinematography is worth it. Alone, you could watch the movie with the sound off. You'd remember it for the rest of your life. There's great acting. There's some powerful moments that sneak up on you. Some sad, grim moments, and some moments of holiday cheer. This doesn't quite tell the whole story, though. And honestly, I don't quite know how the movie ends up being as good as it is. Part of it probably is because of some of the strange choices that I just lamented. They probably do open the door for this movie really shining. One way or another, there is a little bit of magic here, and that's probably the final ingredient in a memorable movie. I don't know much about Nagisa Oshima, but looking at some of his other movies too, I get the sense that that's kind of what he dealt in. Slightly strange movies that maybe just had a little something, a sprinkle of something in them. This is a movie that gives you things to think about. It's a powerful movie. It's a very thought-provoking movie. I mentioned some of the themes already, but it's also just a deeply retrospective movie, a movie that shows people facing up to their potential death, a movie that shows the absurd fortunes of life, But it's not too didactic of a film. To me, this is actually a great movie for the end of the year. Of course, it's not an uplifting Christmas movie exactly, although it does have some moments. But it is, like I said, a retrospective movie. And for me, that's maybe the most important thing about the end of the year, is facing up to, time going by and things like that. That's Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. I have to admit, it's kind of a vibes-based movie more than anything else, but I really enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it. Happy holidays, everybody. I will see you in 2024, where I will probably watch at least one more movie.